Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. So find a comfortable spot, adjust your volume, take a nice deep breath in, let it out slowly, and off we go. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to Sean, the latest member of our Patreon family. Sean, thank you so much for supporting this podcast. Your help makes it possible to keep making new episodes week after week and keep them ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. And because you joined in March, you'll be eligible for this month's Raffle for supporters, the prize for which is your very own copy of the 1897 Sears catalog. It's quite a trip into the past, and I think the winner will love it. If you are interested in learning about the perks available to subscribers on Patreon, you'll find a link in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip. No subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's get to the reading. Tonight, by listener request, we're returning to A Journey to the Western Isles of Scotland by Samuel Johnson, first published in 1775. Let's continue our journey where we left off on the Isle of Skye. Talisker in Skye. From Ullinish, our next stage was to Talisker, the house of Colonel MacLeod, an officer in the Dutch service, who in this time of universal peace has for several years been permitted to be absent from his regiment. Having been bred to physic, he is consequently a scholar, and his lady, by accompanying him in his different places of residence, is become skillful in several languages. Talisker is the place beyond all that I have seen, from which the gay and the jovial seem utterly excluded, and where the hermit might expect to grow old in meditation without possibility of disturbance or interruption. It is situated very near the sea, but upon a coast where no vessel lands but when it is driven by a tempest on the rocks. Towards the land are lofty hills streaming with waterfalls. The garden is sheltered by firs or pines, which grow there so prosperously that some which the present inhabitant planted are very high and thick. At this place we very happily met Mr. Donald MacLean, a young gentleman, the eldest son of the laird of Call, heir to a very great extent of land, and so desirous of improving his inheritance that he spent a considerable time among the farmers of Hertfordshire and Hampshire to learn their practice. He worked with his own hands at the principal operations of agriculture, that he might not deceive himself by a false opinion of skill, which, if he should find it deficient at home, he had no means of completing. If the world has agreed to praise the travels and manual labors of the Tsar of Muscovy, let Call have his share of the like applause, in the proportion of his dominions to the Empire of Russia. This young gentleman was sporting in the mountains of Skye, and when he was weary with following his game, repaired for lodging to Talisker. At night he missed one of his dogs, and when he went to seek him in the morning, found 2 eagles feeding on his carcass. Call, for he must be named by his possessions, hearing that our intention was to visit Jonah, offered to conduct us to his chief, Sir Alan MacLean, who lived in the Isle of Inchkenneth, and would readily find us a convenient passage. From this time was formed an acquaintance, which being begun by kindness, was accidentally continued by constraint. We derived much pleasure from it, and I hope have given him no reason to repent it. The weather was now almost one continued storm, and we were to snatch some happy intermission to be conveyed to Mull, the third island of the Hebrides, lying about a degree south of Skye, whence we might easily find our way to Inchkenneth, where Sir Allan MacLean resided, and afterward to Jonah. For this purpose, the most commodious station that we could take was Armadale, which Sir Alexander MacDonald had now left to a gentleman who lived there as his factor or steward. In our way to Armadale was Corryatachan, where we had already been, and to which therefore we were very willing to return. We stayed, however, so long at Talisker that a great part of our journey was performed in the gloom of the evening. In traveling even thus, almost without light, through naked solitude, when there is a guide whose conduct may be trusted, a mind not naturally too much disposed to fear may preserve some degree of cheerfulness. But what must be the solicitude of him who should be wandering among the crags and hollows, benighted, ignorant, and alone? The fictions of the Gothic romances were not so remote from credibility as they are now thought. In the full prevalence of the feudal institution, when violence desolated the world, and every baron lived in a fortress, forests and castles were regularly succeeded by each other, and the adventurer might very suddenly pass from the gloom of the woods or the ruggedness of moors to seats of plenty, gaiety, and magnificence. Whatever is imagined in the wildest tale, if giants, dragons, and enchantment be excepted, would be felt by him who, wandering in the mountains without a guide, or upon the sea without a pilot, should be carried amidst his terror and uncertainty to the hospitality and elegance of Rasse or Dunvegan. To Corryatachan at last we came, and found ourselves welcomed as before. Here we stayed 2 days, and made such inquiries as curiosity suggested. The house was filled with company, among whom Mr. Macpherson and his sister distinguished themselves by their politeness and accomplishments. By him we were invited to Ostig, a house not far from Armadale, where we might easily hear of a boat when the weather would suffer us to leave the island. Ostig in Skye. At Ostig, of which Mr. Macpherson is minister, we were entertained for some days, then removed to Armadale, where we finished our observations on the island of Skye. As this island lies in the 57th degree, the air cannot be supposed to have much warmth. The long continuance of the sun above the horizon does indeed sometimes produce great heat in northern latitudes, but this can only happen in sheltered places, where the atmosphere is to a certain degree stagnant, and the same mass of air continues to receive for many hours the rays of the sun and the vapors of the earth. Skye lies open on the west and north to a vast extent of ocean, and is cooled in the summer by perpetual ventilation, but by the same blasts is kept warm in winter. Their weather is not pleasing. Half the year is deluged with rain. From the autumnal to the vernal equinox, a dry day is hardly known, except when the showers are suspended by a tempest. Under such skies can be expected no great exuberance of vegetation. Their winter overtakes their summer, and their harvest lies upon the ground drenched with rain. The autumn struggles hard to produce some of our early fruits. I gathered gooseberries in September, but they were small and the husk was thick. Their winter is seldom such as puts a full stop to the growth of plants, or reduces the cattle to live wholly on the surpluses of the summer. In the year 71, they had a severe season, remembered by the name of the Black Spring, from which the island has not yet recovered. The snow lay long upon the ground, a calamity hardly known before. Part of their cattle died for want. Part were unseasonably sold to buy sustenance for their owners. And what I have not read or heard of before, the kind that survived were so emaciated and dispirited that they did not require the mail at the usual time. Many of the roebucks perished as well. The soil, as in other countries, has its diversities. In some parts, there is only a thin layer of earth spread upon a rock, which bears nothing but short brown heath, and perhaps is not generally capable of any better product. There are many bogs or mosses of greater or less extent, where the soil cannot be supposed to want depth, though it is too wet for the plough. But we did not observe in these any aquatic plants. The valleys and the mountains are alike darkened with heath. Some grass, however, grows here and there, and some happier spots of earth are capable of tillage. Their agriculture is laborious, and perhaps rather feeble than unskilful. Their chief manure is seaweed, which when they lay it to rot upon the field, gives them a better crop than those of the highlands. They heap seashells upon the dunghill, which in time moulder into a fertilizing substance. When they find a vein of earth where they cannot use it, they dig it up and add it to the mold of a more commodious place. Their corn grounds often lie in such intricacies among the crags that there is no room for the action of a team and plough. The soil is then turned up by manual labor, with an instrument called a crooked spade, of a form and weight which to me appeared very incommodious, and would perhaps be soon improved in a country where workmen could be easily found and easily paid. It has a narrow blade of iron fixed to a long and heavy piece of wood, which must have about 1.5 feet above the iron, a knee or flexure with the angle downwards. When the farmer encounters a stone, which is the great impediment of his operations, he drives the blade under it, and bringing the knee or angle to the ground, has in the long handle a very forcible lever. According to the different mode of tillage, farms are distinguished into long land and short land. Long land is that which affords room for a plough, and short land is turned up by the spade. The grain which they commit to the furrows thus tediously formed is either oats or barley. They do not sow barley without very copious manure, and then they expect from it 10 for 1, an increase equal to that of better countries. But the culture is so operose that they content themselves commonly with oats. And who can relate without compassion that after all their diligence they are to expect only a triple increase? It is in vain to hope for plenty when a third part of the harvest must be reserved for seed. When their grain is arrived at the state which they must consider as ripeness, they do not cut but pull the barley. To the oats they apply the sickle. Wheel carriages they have none, but make a frame of timber, which is drawn by one horse with the 2 points behind pressing on the ground. On this they sometimes drag home their sheaves, but often convey them home in a kind of open pannier or frame of sticks upon the horse's back. Of that which is obtained with so much difficulty, nothing surely ought to be wasted, yet their method of clearing their oats from the husk is by parching them in the straw. Thus, with the genuine improvidence of savages, they destroy that fodder for want of which their cattle may perish. From this practice they have 2 petty conveniences. They dry the grain so that it is easily reduced to meal, and they escape the theft of the thresher. The taste contracted from the fire by the oats, as by every other scorched substance, use must long ago have made grateful. The oats that are not parched must be dried in a kiln. The barns of Skye I never saw. That which MacLeod of Rassay had erected near his house was so contrived because the harvest is seldom brought home dry, as by perpetual perflation to prevent the mow from heating. Of their gardens I can judge only from their tables. I did not observe that the common greens were wanting, and suppose that by choosing an advantageous exposition they can raise all the more hardy esculent plants. Of vegetable fragrance or beauty they are not yet studious. Few vows are made to Flora in the Hebrides. They gather a little hay, but the grass is mown late, and is so often almost dry and again very wet before it is housed, that it becomes a collection of withered stalks without taste or fragrance. It must be eaten by cattle that have nothing else, but by most English farmers would be thrown away. In the islands, I have not heard that any subterraneous treasures have been discovered, though where there are mountains, there are commonly minerals. One of the rocks in Cole has a black vein, imagined to consist of the ore of lead, but it was never yet opened or essayed. In Skye, a black mass was accidentally picked up and brought into the house of the owner of the land, who found himself strongly inclined to think it a coal, but unhappily it did not burn in the chimney. Common ores would be here of no great value, for what requires to be separated by fire must, if it were found, be carried away in its mineral state, here being no fuel for the smelting house or forge. Perhaps by diligent search in this world of stone, some valuable species of marble might be discovered, but neither philosophical curiosity nor commercial industry have yet fixed their abode here, where the importunity of immediate wants supplied but for the day and craving on the morrow has left little room for excursive knowledge or the pleasing fancies of distant profit. They have lately found a manufacture considerably lucrative. Their rocks abound with kelp, a sea plant, of which the ashes are melted into glass. They burn kelp in great quantities, and then send it away in ships, which come regularly to purchase them. This new source of riches has raised the rents of many maritime farms, but the tenants pay, like all other tenants, the additional rent with great unwillingness, because they consider the profits of the kelp as the mere product of personal labor to which the landlord contributes nothing. However, as any man may be said to give what he gives the power of gaining, he has certainly as much right to profit from the price of kelp as of any other thing found or raised upon his ground. This new trade has excited a long and eager litigation between MacDonald and MacLeod for a ledge of rocks, which, till the value of kelp was known, neither of them desired the reputation of possessing. The cattle of Skye are not so small as is commonly believed. Since they have sent their beeves in great numbers to southern marts, they have probably taken more care of their breed. At stated times, the annual growth of cattle is driven to a fair by a general drover, and with the money which he returns to the farmer, the rents are paid. The price regularly expected is from £2 to £3 a head. There was once one sold for £5. They go from the islands very lean, and are not offered to the butcher till they have been long fatted in English pastures. Of their black cattle, some are without horns, called by the Scots humble cows, as we call a bee a humble bee that wants a sting. Whether this difference be specific or accidental, though we inquired with great diligence, we could not be informed. We are not very sure that the bull is ever without horns, though we have been told that such bulls there are. What is produced by putting a horned and unhorned male and female together, no man has ever tried that thought the result worthy of observation. Their horses are, like their cows, of a moderate size. I had no difficulty to mount myself commodiously by the favor of the gentleman. I heard of very little cows in Barra, and very little horses in Rum, where perhaps no care is taken to prevent that diminution of size which must always happen where the greater and the less copulate promiscuously, and the young animal is restrained from growth by penury of sustenance. The goat is the general inhabitant of the earth, complying with every difference of climate and of soil. The goats of the Hebrides are like others, nor did I hear anything of their sheep to be particularly remarked. In the penury of these malignant regions, nothing is left that can be converted to food. The goats and the sheep are milked like the cows. A single meal of a goat is a quart, and of a sheep a pint. Such at least was the account which I could extract from those of whom I am not sure that they ever had inquired. The milk of goats is much thinner than that of cows, and that of sheep is much thicker. Sheep's milk is never eaten before it is boiled. As it is thick, it must be very liberal of curd, and the people of St. Kilda form it into small cheeses. The stags of the mountains are less than those of our parks or forests, perhaps not bigger than our fallow deer. Their flesh has no rankness, nor is inferior in flavor to our common venison. The roebuck I neither saw nor tasted. These are not countries for a regular chase. The deer are not driven with horns and hounds. A sportsman with his gun in his hand watches the animal, and when he has wounded him, traces him by the blood. They have a race of brindled greyhounds, larger and stronger than those with which we course hares, and those are the only dogs used by them for the chase. Man is, by the use of firearms, made so much an overmatch for other animals, that in all countries where they are in use, the wild part of the creation sensibly diminishes. There will probably not be long either stags or roebucks in the islands. All the beasts of chase would have been lost long ago in countries well inhabited, had they not been preserved by laws for the pleasure of the rich. There are in Skye neither rats nor mice, but the weasel is so frequent that he is heard in houses rattling behind chests or beds as rats in England. They probably owe to his predominance that they have no other vermin, for since the great rat took possession of this part of the world, scarce a ship can touch at any port but some of his race are left behind. They have within these few years begun to infest the Isle of Coll, where being left by some trading vessel, they have increased for want of weasels to oppose them. The inhabitants of Skye and of the other islands which I have seen are commonly of the middle stature, with fewer among them very tall or very short than are seen in England, or perhaps as their numbers are small, the chances of any deviation from the common measure are necessarily few. The tallest men that I saw are among those of higher rank. In regions of barrenness and scarcity, the human race is hindered in its growth by the same causes as other animals. The ladies have as much beauty here as in other places, but bloom and softness are not to be expected among the lower classes, whose faces are exposed to the rudeness of the climate, and whose features are sometimes contracted by want, and sometimes hardened by the blasts. Supreme beauty is seldom found in cottages or workshops, even where no real hardships are suffered. To expand the human face to its full perfection, it seems necessary that the mind should cooperate by placidness of content or consciousness of superiority. Their strength is proportionate to their size, but they are accustomed to run upon rough ground, and therefore can with great agility skip over the bog or clamber the mountain. For a campaign in the wastes of America, soldiers better qualified could not have been found. Having little work to do, they are not willing, nor perhaps able, to endure a long continuance of manual labor, and are therefore considered as habitually idle. Having never been supplied with those accommodations which life extensively diversified with trades affords, they supply their wants by very insufficient shifts, and endure many inconveniences which a little attention would easily relieve. I have seen a horse carrying home the harvest on a crate. Under his tail was a stick for a crupper, held at the two ends by twists of straw. Hemp will grow in these islands, and therefore ropes may be had. If they wanted hemp, they might make better cordage of rushes, or perhaps of nettles, than of straw. Their method of life neither secures them perpetual health, nor exposes them to any particular diseases. There are physicians in these islands who, I believe, all practice surgery, and all compound their own medicines. It is generally supposed that life is longer in places where there are few opportunities of luxury, but I found no instance here of extraordinary longevity. A cottager grows old over his oaten cakes, like a citizen at a turtle feast. He is indeed seldom incommoded by corpulence. Poverty preserves him from sinking under the burden of himself, but he escapes no other injury of time. Instances of long life are often related, which those who hear them are more willing to credit than examine. To be told that any man has attained 100 years gives hope and comfort to him who stands trembling on the brink of his own climacteric. Length of life is distributed impartially to very different modes of life in very different climates, and the mountains have no greater examples of age and health than the lowlands, where I was introduced to two ladies of high quality, one of whom, in her 94th year, presided at her table with the full exercise of all her powers, and the other has attained her 84th without any diminution of her vivacity, and with little reason to accuse time of depredations on her beauty. In the islands, as in most other places, the inhabitants are of different rank, and one does not encroach here upon another. Where there is no commerce nor manufacture, he that is born poor can scarcely become rich, and if none are able to buy estates, he that is born to land cannot annihilate his family by selling it. This was once the state of these countries. Perhaps there is no example, till within a century and a half, of any family whose estate was alienated otherwise than by violence or forfeiture. Since money has been brought amongst them, they have found, like others, the art of spending more than they receive. And I saw with grief the chief of a very ancient clan, whose island was condemned by law to be sold for the satisfaction of his creditors. The name of highest dignity is laird, of which there are in the extensive Isle of Skye only 3, MacDonald, MacLeod, and Mackinnon. The laird is the original owner of the land, whose natural power must be very great, where no man lives but by agriculture, and where the produce of the land is not conveyed through the labyrinths of traffic, but passes directly from the hand that gathers it to the mouth that eats it. The laird has all those in his power that live upon his farms. Kings can, for the most part, only exalt or degrade. The laird at pleasure can feed or starve, can give bread or withhold it. This inherent power was yet strengthened by the kindness of consanguinity and the reverence of patriarchal authority. The laird was the father of the clan, and his tenants commonly bore his name. And to these principles of original command was added for many ages an exclusive right of legal jurisdiction. This multifarious and extensive obligation operated with force scarcely credible. Every duty, moral or political, was absorbed in affection and adherence to the chief. Not many years have passed since the clans knew no law but the laird's will. He told them to whom they should be friends or enemies, what king they should obey, and what religion they should profess. When the Scots first rose in arms against the succession of the House of Hanover, Lovat, the chief of the Frasers, was in exile. The Frasers were very numerous and very zealous against the government. A pardon was sent to Lovat. He came to the English camp, and the clan immediately deserted to him. Next in dignity to the laird is the tacksman, a large taker or leaseholder of land, of which he keeps part as a domain in his own hand, and lets part to under-tenants. The tacksman is necessarily a man capable of securing to the laird the whole rent, and is commonly a collateral relation. These tax, or subordinate possessions, were long considered as hereditary, and the occupant was distinguished by the name of the place at which he resided. He held a middle station, by which the highest and the lowest orders were connected. He paid rent and reverence to the laird, and received them from the tenants. This tenure still subsists with its original operation, but not with the primitive stability. Since the islanders, no longer content to live, have learned the desire of growing rich, an ancient dependent is in danger of giving way to a higher bidder at the expense of domestic dignity and hereditary power. The stranger whose money buys him preference considers himself as paying for all that he has, and is indifferent about the laird's honor or safety. The commodiousness of money is indeed great, but there are some advantages which money cannot buy, and which therefore no wise man will by the love of money be tempted to forego. I have found in the hither parts of Scotland men not defective in judgment or general appearance, who consider the tacksman as a useless burden of the ground, as a drone who lives upon the product of an estate without the right of property or the merit of labor, and who impoverishes at once the landlord and the tenant. The land, say they, is let to the tacksman at 6d. an acre, and by him to the tenant at 10d. Let the owner be the immediate landlord to all the tenants. If he sets the ground at 8d, he will increase his revenue by a 4th part, and the tenant's burden will be diminished by a 5th. Those who pursue this train of reasoning seem not sufficiently to inquire whither it will lead them, nor to know that it will equally show the propriety of suppressing all wholesale trade, of shutting up the shops of every man who sells what he does not make, and of extruding all whose agency and profit intervene between the manufacturer and the consumer. They may, by stretching their understandings a little wider, comprehend that all those who, by undertaking large quantities of manufacture and affording employment to many laborers, make themselves considered as benefactors to the public, having only been robbing their workmen with one hand and their customers with the other. If Crowley had sold only what he could make, and all his smiths had wrought their own iron with their own hammers, he would have lived on less, and they would have sold their work for more. The salaries of superintendents and clerks would have been partly saved and partly shared, and nails been sometimes cheaper by a farthing in 100. But then, if the smith could not have found an immediate purchaser, he must have deserted his anvil. If there had by accident at any time been more sellers than buyers, the workmen must have reduced their profit to nothing by underselling one another. And as no great stock could have been in any hand, no sudden demand of large quantities could have been answered, and the builder must have stood still till the nailer could supply him. According to these schemes, universal plenty is to begin and end in universal misery. Hope and emulation will be utterly extinguished, and as all must obey the call of immediate necessity, nothing that requires extensive views or provides for distant consequences will ever be performed. To the southern inhabitants of Scotland, the state of the mountains and the islands is equally unknown with that of Borneo or Sumatra. Of both they have only heard a little and guess the rest. They are strangers to the language and the manners, to the advantages and wants of the people, whose life they would model, and whose evils they would remedy. Nothing is less difficult than to procure one convenience by the forfeiture of another. A soldier may expedite his march by throwing away his arms. To banish the taxman is easy. To make a country plentiful by diminishing the people is an expeditious mode of husbandry. But little abundance, which there is nobody to enjoy, contributes little to human happiness. As the mind must govern the hands, so in every society the man of intelligence must direct the man of labor. If the taxman be taken away, the Hebrides must in their present state be given up to grossness and ignorance. The tenant, for want of instruction, will be unskilful, and for want of admonition will be negligent. The laird in these wide estates, which often consist of islands remote from one another, cannot extend his personal influence to all his tenants, and the steward, having no dignity annexed to his character, can have little authority among men taught to pay reverence only to birth, and who regard the taxman as their hereditary superior. Nor can the steward have equal zeal for the prosperity of an estate profitable only to the laird, with the taxman who has the laird's income involved in his own. The only gentlemen in the islands are the lairds, the tacksmen, and the ministers, who frequently improve their livings by becoming farmers. If the tacksmen be banished, who will be left to impart knowledge or impress civility? The laird must always be at a distance from the greater part of his lands, and if he resides at all upon them, must drag his days in solitude, having no longer either a friend or a companion. He will therefore depart to some more comfortable residence, and leave the tenants to the wisdom and mercy of a factor. Of tenants there are different orders, as they have greater or less stock. Land is sometimes leased to a small fellowship, who live in a cluster of huts, called a tenant's town, and are bound jointly and separately for the payment of their rent. These, I believe, employ in the care of their cattle and the labor of tillage. A kind of tenants yet lower, who having a hut with grass for a certain number of cows and sheep, pay their rent by a stipulated quantity of labor. The condition of domestic servants, or the price of occasional labor, I do not know with certainty. I was told that the maids have sheep, and are allowed to spin for their own clothing. Perhaps they have no pecuniary wages, or none but in very wealthy families. The state of life, which has hitherto been purely pastoral, begins now to be a little variegated with commerce. But novelties enter by degrees, until one mode has fully prevailed over the other, no settled notion can be formed. Such is the system of insular subordination, which, having little variety, cannot afford much delight in the view, nor long detain the mind in contemplation. The inhabitants were for a long time perhaps not unhappy, but their content was a muddy mixture of pride and ignorance, an indifference for pleasures which they did not know, a blind veneration for their chiefs, and a strong conviction of their own importance. Their pride has been crushed by the heavy hand of a vindictive conqueror, whose 70s have been followed by laws which, though they cannot be called cruel, have produced much discontent, because they operate upon the surface of life and make every eye bear witness to subjection. To be compelled to a new dress has always been found painful. And with that, I think we'll end this evening's reading from A Journey to the Western Islands of Scotland by Samuel Johnson. Once again, Dr. Johnson has proved himself to be a man of much opinion. If you'd like to read his work for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, or suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, the best place to catch me is on Twitter at BoringBooksPod, or send me an email via our website, boringbookspod.com. I always love hearing from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.